voluntary assisted dying, more commonly known, of course, as euthanasia, is only lawful in Victoria, but it could soon be a major part of debate in New South Wales when Parliament returns for 2021. Now, in a poll released by the Australia Institute over the weekend, there was, it seems, a strong show of support for assisted dying. 72% of respondents agreed that it should be legal. And an even further headache, I suppose, for the New South Wales government, 74% of coalition voters themselves are, it seems, pro-euthanasia. Now, we know polls aren't always accurate, but these numbers have been fairly solid for quite a long time. Now, the Premier Berejiklian has reiterated her desire for Parliament to not debate a change to the current law.
Can I stress it's not government policy. It's not something that I think we should be looking at this time, but I also appreciate people have very strong views on there. I've made my views known. And also, I'm not going to answer a hypothetical question on something that's not been presented, and I've made my views very clear on that issue.
Now, we've all got our own personal point of view on this, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. But despite the Premier's desire to keep assisted dying off the agenda, legislation is currently being drafted. And joining me now to discuss this is the President of Dying with Dignity, Penny Hackett. Penny, nice to talk with you again.
Yeah, nice to talk to you, Michael. I hope my line doesn't drop out. It's been a bit...
It's a wild one out there tonight, there's no doubt about it. Now, look, as I said, we've all got our own personal stories when it comes to this issue. I lost my own father no more than 12 months ago from cancer. He didn't obviously have access to euthanasia, and I don't think he would have chose it for himself even if he had. But with that established, I think a lot of people say, even if it's not for me, who am I to stand in the way of it being for somebody else? And I think that's where the debate is now, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the important thing to note is that it is voluntary, and the regimes that have been put forward in Australia require a mentally competent adult who has a terminal illness with a prognosis of either 6 months or, for those terrible neurodegenerative diseases like motor neuron disease, 12 months. Very strict safeguards, and it's voluntary for the person involved, and it's not a requirement that any healthcare practitioner be compelled to participate. So the conscientious objection provisions are there. And it comes down to should the views of a very small minority of people who oppose this determine health policy regarding the end of life, medical care of the rest of the community.
Well, I suppose in the crudest sense of numeracy that is true, but there again, historically, parliaments, and we've asked our parliaments to do this, have been about creating laws that preserve life and cherish life. And here we have a situation where we are asking parliaments to do something a bit different, and that is to make it easier for somebody to end their life, given, of course, the circumstances which you and I are discussing. So how do we convince the more conservative aspect of the political agenda that maybe they need to change tack on this?
It just comes down to the evidence. So these regimes have been in place in a number of overseas jurisdictions, and there has been no evidence of abuse that worked well. The communities and the medical professions are comfortable with the way things are working. So using Oregon, for example, that's been going for about 22 years, and the number of deaths under that law have been, on average, 0.45% of deaths. And it works well. There's no outcry from the people of Oregon that it's working badly or it's dangerous. Also using Switzerland as an example, they've had a legalised regime since the 1940s, and you wouldn't call Switzerland a country that is on the verge of moral collapse.
No.
You know, so the slippery slopes and the claims of danger to vulnerable people are just not borne out by the evidence, and we want MPs to vote on facts, not fear.
There are two different models being considered in New South Wales. As you said, we've got the Victorian situation underway. Already it's legislated, it's operating. There is also a work in progress in Western Australia with slightly different regulations. And my understanding is it's the WA model which may well be put forward in New South Wales. Is that your understanding?
definitely. They are substantially the same, the models. The Western Australian one differs in a few procedural components. Now that we've had some learnings from Victoria, where in the last report, 124 people had used it. So the tsunami of death that was predicted by some people has just not eventuated. But there have been some issues with access for people in rural and regional areas for telehealth and requirement that one of the doctors be a specialist. I mean, we know, even living in Sydney, that sometimes it can be damn near impossible to see a specialist. Imagine if you are in Western Australia out in, the Kimberley or something. So they have still very strong safeguards, which are substantially the same as Victoria, but there are some differences. And we would say New South Wales having a much bigger area and a more disparate population, that the WA model would be most appropriate.
Yes.
So also Tasmania is on the verge of passing a law. It's as good as passed. The key people have indicated that they will vote for it when Parliament resumes. So in March, Tasmania will have an assisted dying law, and Queenslander also was an election commitment, and they're looking at introducing a bill in May, and South Australia right now has a bill in Parliament introduced in both houses a couple of weeks ago.
There is definitely movement. There is definitely movement. Just in 30 seconds, can I ask you this finally, or make this point? I think we'd all be kidding ourselves if we didn't think that people were already taking their own life, but with far less regulation, far less care, far less control from the state, in devastating circumstances. So it does make sense for those I think, and I am a conservative, to try to bring legislation around this space to regulate what is a very, very difficult and personal moment in someone's journey.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely. And this is not, it's perceived as a lefty progressive issue, and it absolutely is not. It is for people that have a very strong religious belief, which is a relatively small minority of the community. There is overwhelming community support for this. And we know that it happens. We know that doctors help patients to die often. And I call that nudge, nudge, wink, wink euthanasia. And there are no regulations around it. It puts the doctor at risk, it puts the families at risk, and then there are the suicides. So in parliamentary inquiries in other states, in WA, Victoria, it was estimated by the coroner that 8 to 10% of suicides were people who had terminal or debilitating illness.
That's correct.
And I know from personal experience, a friend of mine's mother jumped in front of a train at Linfield Station, and she had no other way. The medical options that would have been offered to her were to starve and dehydrate to death, which is not really a great way to go. And it's legal to commit suicide. So imagine the devastation to her family, the train drivers, the police, ambulance workers.
Everybody involved, that's right.
Yeah,
involved.
It's just not right that situation should continue.
I'm glad we've spoken. It's a difficult topic, but it will be on the agenda in 2021.